Who's tracking us? The enemy sniper murmured into his radio just before the line went silent. Over the course of 18 months, 90 American soldiers had been killed in that valley, taken out one by unseen ghosts no one could locate. Then Staff Sergeant Lara Quinn arrived, carrying a rifle, a weathered notebook filled with Sergeant Miles Quinn's teachings, and the kind of patience that flipped the roles of predator and prey. What she accomplished in those jagged mountains didn't just stop the bloodshed. It made hardened men fear the darkness itself. At 29, Staff Sergeant Lara Quinn had been in Halkarash province for 7 weeks when she stepped into the briefing room at Outpost Granite Ridge and saw the wall. It was covered edge to edge with photographs. 90 faces, 90 names, 90 soldiers killed by sniper fire in Wonvadran Gorge over the last year and a half. The intelligence officer called it the most concentrated sniper zone in the entire region. The rest just called it a graveyard. Lara stood 5'6", weighed around 140 pounds, and had grown up in rural Wyoming, learning to shoot from a Vietnam veteran who never missed a target. She spoke little, in that unsettling way that made others think she wasn't listening. But she noticed everything. How shadows stretched, how wind slid through the trees, how men's voices changed when fear crept in, but pride held them back. She served as a sniper in the 101st Airborne Division's counter-sniper unit, sent there to end the nightmare that had taken nearly 100 lives. Her task sounded simple: find the shooters and stop them, but nothing in Wonvadran Gorge ever was. Before we continue, drop a comment and tell that's Old Bill's Tales where you're watching from. And if stories like this deserve to be told, hit subscribe so we can keep sharing them. Sergeant Miles Quinn. Her grandfather had been a Marine Corps sniper during Vietnam. He returned home in 1971 with a silver star he never discussed and a leather-bound journal he kept tucked away in a desk drawer. When Lara turned 12, he began teaching her to shoot, not by plinking soda cans off a fence, but the way he'd been trained at Camp Pendleton back in 1966. Breathing control, trigger discipline, reading the land, and mastering patience. The deadliest weapon of all. By 16, she could track moving targets at 600 yards and gauge the wind by the sway of grass. Her grandfather told her that shooting was mathematics and stillness, but true hunting meant knowing your enemy better than he knew himself. The best snipers, he said, weren't the ones who pulled off impossible shots. They were the ones who didn't need to, because they already knew where the target would stand before he did. At 19, Lara enlisted in the infantry, later applying to sniper school at Camp Windmere. After her first Iraq deployment, she graduated second in her class. Her instructor told her she had the best fieldcraft he'd seen in 5 years, but she needed to trust her instincts more. So she did. By her third deployment, Lara Quinn wasn't just pulling triggers. She was solving problems others didn't even recognize yet. 2 months before she shipped out to Halkarash province, her grandfather, Sergeant Miles Quinn, passed away. He left her his old journal, filled with hand-drawn maps, notes on enemy behavior, and one chilling sentence scrawled across the last page: "The hunter who moves first loses." She carried that journal everywhere. The next briefing was led by Colonel Hayes, a lieutenant colonel who had lost 11 men to sniper fire in the past 4 months. Standing before the wall of fallen faces, he told the room they had tried everything: counter-sniper teams, expanded patrols, even air support. Nothing worked. The enemy operated in pairs or trios, constantly changing positions and leaving behind no trace. They struck from 400 to 700 meters, usually during patrol transitions or convoy halts, then vanished like smoke before anyone could respond. When Colonel Hayes turned to Lara and asked if she had a plan, she simply said she needed 3 days to study the land and the rhythm of the attacks. Captain Rourke scoffed, saying they didn't have time for theory. They needed boots on the dirt, not notebooks in tents. Another officer muttered that they'd already sent their best, and the shooters were simply better. Lara calmly asked for every after-action report and the grid coordinates of each attack. Captain Rourke snapped that they'd already run the data and found no pattern. She didn't argue, just repeated her request. Colonel Hayes handed her the files. That night, in the dim light of her tent, she spread 68 reports across the floor and began mapping them out, using Sergeant Miles Quinn's journal as her compass. She searched for details others had missed: the hour of engagement, the weather, patrol direction, even where the sun sat in the sky. By 0300 hours, it clicked. The shooters weren't random. They followed a method. Sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by papers, Lara thought of the 90 soldiers on that wall. Most were younger than she was. Some hadn't even finished their first tour. All had families still waiting for an answer that might never come. Her grandfather's words echoed in her head. Every sniper is a puzzle, and to solve him, you have to think like him, not just tactically, but emotionally. What scared him? What gave him comfort? What made him feel untouchable? The answers, she knew, would reveal his next move. She flipped through the journal and found a sketch of a small village in Lang Hoa province, with a note beneath it. They always return to the high ground. Familiarity is safety. Discipline becomes routine, and routine can be predicted. Looking back at her map, she saw it. The attacks formed clusters along 3 ridgelines overlooking the main supply road through the Vadran Gorge. The snipers struck in the morning and late afternoon, when the sun was low and the shadows stretched long. They'd rarely fire more than a pair of rounds from any single perch, yet those perches themselves traced a pattern, a rotating cycle that brought them back to the same general sectors every 8 to 10 days. They weren't phantoms. They were methodical, well-trained, and running a system that had kept them alive for a year and a half. Systems, however, can be torn. You only had to find the seam. Lara laid out her analysis to Colonel Hayes took the next morning, explaining that the enemy teams cycled through 3 primary hide sites on ridgelines that gave overlapping angles of fire onto the valley road. They exploited natural features, rock shelves, tree lines, dry stream beds, that offered concealment and cover while also constraining their mobility. If she could predict which hide they would pick next, she could be waiting for them. Hayes asked how sure she was. She said 70%. He replied that wasn't sufficient. She answered that 70 was better than 0, which was their current state. Captain Rourke called the idea a waste, saying sending her alone risked making another photograph for the wall if she died. Hayes overruled him and greenlit the op with mandatory radio check-ins every 12 hours to keep accountability. Lara slipped out before dawn with her M210 enhanced rifle, a spotting scope, 4 days of rations, and Sergeant Miles Quinn's journal. The M210 was chambered in a .300 Winchester Magnum and effective well past 200 meters. She didn't intend to engage at the weapon's maximum, but she wanted the option. She took up a position on a ridgeline about 1,500 meters south of the site she predicted they'd use next. The hide she dug was shallow, sheathed in native brush, and sighted so the afternoon sun would be at her back. Then she waited. Day 1 was silent. On day 2, a patrol moved through the valley below and was engaged from roughly 800 meters to her north. 2 soldiers were struck. She listened to the radio as the patrol returned fire, watched the medic move up, and heard the medevac called. Through her scope, she couldn't get a clear shot before the shooter displaced. Day 3 delivered nothing. On the 4th day, just after 1,500 hours, she saw movement. 2 men eased into a rocky outcrop some 600 meters northeast of her hide, slow and professional. One carried a scoped rifle, the other a spotting scope and a radio. They settled into a natural depression between boulders with a clean sight line to the road where convoys habitually paused to check for IEDs. Lara checked her breathing and ran the numbers. Range 610 meters, wind gusting northwest at 8 to 10 miles per hour. She sat 40 meters higher than the target. Temperature in the high 80s, calling for slight elevation compensation. Adjusted her scope and watched the heat shimmer rise off the stones between them, a thin distortion that bent the air and muddied the sight picture. Her grandfather had taught her the hard rule. The second shot is always harder than the first, because the first tells the enemy where you are. If you're taking 2 targets, you do it fast, or you don't do it at all. The radio operator adjusted his stance for barely 3 seconds. Both targets were aligned so tightly that only 2 feet separated them laterally. Lara Quinn exhaled halfway, held the rest, and squeezed the trigger. The shot hit the spotter square in the upper chest. Without hesitation, she cycled the bolt, reacquired her aim as the second man began to move, and fired again. He collapsed instantly. She kept her position, eyes steady through the scope. Nothing stirred. Keying her radio, she calmly reported 2 enemy combatants neutralized, transmitted their coordinates, then waited another 30 minutes to confirm no further movement. When none appeared, a clearing team was dispatched. They verified 2 enemy KIA and recovered a Soviet-era Dragunov rifle, a Chinese-made spotting scope, a radio, and a notebook filled with hand-drawn maps of Vadran Gorge. Intelligence later confirmed the pair were part of a 3-man sniper cell responsible for at least 40 of the 90 deaths. Data from the notebook led to a drone strike 2 weeks later that eliminated the 3rd member. The killing stopped. For the next 6 months, patrols passed through Vadran Gorge without a single sniper attack. The wall of photographs remained as a memorial, but no new names were added. Lara Burg stayed in country another 4 months, deployed to other regions plagued by sniper threats, with identical results. She found them, and she ended them. Colonel Hayes submitted her for a Bronze Star with Valor, and command pushed it through on urgent priority. 2 months later, the medal was pinned to her uniform during a ceremony at base. Captain Rourke attended, shook her hand, and admitted he had been wrong. She accepted it and moved on. Upon returning stateside, she was reassigned to the Marksmanship Training Unit at Camp Windmere, where she spent the next 3 years teaching new snipers the same lessons. Sergeant Miles Quinn had taught her patience, observation, and the understanding that every enemy was a human being with patterns, fears, and routines. The sniper who studied those would always prevail. She kept her grandfather's journal tucked in her kit, often rereading the final page. The hunter who moves first loses. She began repeating that line to every student who passed through her classes, just as her grandfather had told her years ago. It had been true in Vietnam. It was true in Korash province. And it would remain true in whatever war followed. fought by those who learned from the past and refused to let their brothers and sisters die for nothing.